Friends, welcome to Freedom Friday. It is Friday, but you are still not free. Hopefully you will be freer after this hour. With all of the gang and me, brothers, we are going to talk today about what they don't want you to know about Martin Luther King Jr. Every year around this time, we have breakfasts and buffets and well-dressed people who go into hotels and hear speeches. And there's a whole syndicate of national people who will give speeches. And that's what they do every year, is give sometimes the same speech. And it's a very sanitized, clean, upper middle class version of what Martin Luther King, Dr. King, stood for in his life. And I know you two, Ish, as a teacher in the Philly public schools, Sharif, you as a dropout of a teacher from the public schools, we should be teaching more than the sanitized version of what Dr. King was. Let's just start with one thing. This is something many people know, but we pretend like we don't know it. Dr. King was a very unpopular person on the day that he died.
It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free.
People grew a love for him all of a sudden after he was dead. So I guess the best way for America to love you is to be assassinated. But let's talk about that, and let's talk about the Dr. King that they don't want you to know about. Who wants to jump in and start with just a breakdown a little bit around the difference between the sanitized version and the actual Dr. King?
Yeah, good. Jump in there, Ish.
Well, first, I got to say that, this morning when I was meditating on the fact that King Day is coming up, I came across an Amos Wilson quote. And I just want to start off this whole conversation with that. And it's like, ironically, we now see even other people who are not our friends joining us in this celebration, which means that they must see in it some means of protecting their own interest and see in it something that works for them and possibly against us. And I think that speaks directly to what King Day has become. Not only was King not popular when he was assassinated by even majority of Black folks in America, but even when it became a holiday and conversations around that was a huge lift. And even Arizona and John McCain went out of his way to vote against it. So we need to stop, there's a whole legacy around King that folks want to just whitewash and just focus on this. Can't we all just get along? People should be judged by the content of their character and not their skin color. You're racist by talking about race. And they have used King's legacy to make that argument. And so when I think about Amos Wilson, when I was meditating on that this morning and I saw this quote, I was just like, this speaks directly to what the issue has become with how King has been portrayed, not just in popular mainstream ways, but also how he's displayed in school. I mean, even kids are like, you ask them who started Black History Month, they'll be like, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King becomes the answer for everything having to do with Black history.
But he freed the slaves as well. So,
he freed the slaves, ended everything.
He invented the peanut.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a good start. That's a good place to start, because it is very true that we have people that would have hated Dr. King who are going to next week or in this next, this time every year, who are going to be lionizing him. They're going to be lifting him up, and they are going to sanitize him on what you just said. For instance, Dr. King wanted us all to be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. And I have a dream, I have a dream one day, and it's like they find one line and they forget all the rest of it. What did he say about the three evils? Right?
The isms. Yeah.
What are the three evils that he said?
They're in love with militarism.
Yes.
Right. They
racism
absolutely
and
love,
poverty.
they lead by that. They're war hawks. And at the same time, they will quote Dr. King for something, especially if they want you to turn the other cheek when they're beating you upside the head, whether it's through policy or otherwise. First thing they say, hey, Dr. King said, be nonviolent, So, yeah, I think the what is it? Capitalism, militarism, and racism, right? Are the three, and how embedded they are, not just wedded to each other and embedded in our country.
Yeah. So it was capitalism, militarism, and racism with a strong focus on poverty as being a like a real sign that your nation is doing wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, now think about the people who are going to talk about the "I Have a Dream" stuff next week, and many of them are all about us being patriotic to a country, and they see patriotism as being in support of wars and in support of the war machine.
Oh, absolutely.
In support of Raytheon and in support of, right? Like, we have people who sit on the board of Raytheon who are going to be talking online about Dr. King next week, right? I think something else.
Host one of those brunches you talked about.
Absolutely. I can imagine that there's going to be an MLK brunch in the lobby of like Boeing, right? And they're not going to see any irony of that either, right? Because the Dr. King that they're talking about, the sanitized one, for instance, let's just back all the way up. Is there a strong critique by any civil rights people or mainstream organizations right now of capitalism and what capitalism is doing for our communities and the ravages of capitalism? That was one of his core tenets. Is anybody going to talk about that next week? Is there going to be a speech on that? Do you think anybody at the Hilton over their $100 breakfast is going to talk about that?
Nah.
Yeah.
Highly unlikely.
Maybe financial literacy, right? That's what's needed. We just have to prepare people to be able to survive the exploitative system that they're about to enter, but not really truly address.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like a social critique,
no social
critique.
critique.
The other thing is, you mentioned the kids, and we got to remind people, like, this stuff is not that long ago. I was reading the other day that, one of the folks who marched with Dr. King in Memphis about, the sanitation worker just recently died. Mm-hmm. So, like, had Dr. King not been subjected to domestic terrorism, mind you that, FBI is still not, just maybe recently considered domestic terrorism as a thing when that's always been a thing in this country and has continued. And that's what addressed him. Like, so he could have plausibly, without that, he would have, more people who don't have like the context and the timeline, they would have been able to see like very elderly, Dr. King, maybe a few years ago, but that's, just something to remind people that this stuff is not that long ago. And if anything, many of these things got worse when you're talking about the black-white wealth gap, when you're talking about the 1%, the 99% wealth gap, when you're talking about the 200-something American military bases around the country. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's only what is it, like 300 countries in the world? Like we have 200 military bases. Like, so almost a military, like talking about like trying to be imperialistic and empire. You always see people posting online like, oh, my goals. Like their goals is to like be this empire, like to have 200 some military bases, bro. And then we look at the infrastructure in this country that's crumbling. We look at the poverty level. We look at all the things that are not invested in. But we got 200 military bases.
The point that you just made, years ago, I visited Memphis, and they told me in Memphis that there had been something passed locally. I can't remember if it was the city or the state, to make right for all those sanitation workers. They were going to give them the ones that were still living.
Yeah, I remember you telling me
they were going to give them their
yeah.
pensions finally, because they never got their just due, and then it got talked about for a long period of time. And someone told me privately and a little bit cynically that they were waiting for them to die off so they wouldn't have to pay out as much money. And the last guy who finally got his money, his pension, was still on the truck, still sanitation working when I was there. Right. This is years ago. This is a few years ago. But I was like, so this dude was there when Dr. King, he was on a truck when Dr. King came there to fight for him. He's still there today. Much older, of course, and he still hasn't been paid. He still hasn't been given his just due, like his pension and all the things that they had been denied. Mm-hmm. That's in our lifetime. Yeah. Right. Imagine that. The man went down. And first of all, let's back up. What do y'all know about the killing of Dr. King? Why was it important to kill him at that precise moment? Because he had already been persona non grata for the country. They had already considered him one of the most dangerous men in America, but they didn't kill him until that point. What was it about his life at that moment that it was important to kill him then?
I mean, from my recollection, it was really about, anytime you start unifying across classes, across race, you become far more dangerous. Like if you have a myopic, as much as important as it is to focus on the most marginalized, which tend to be Black, Indigenous, like group, but once you start like saying like, wait a minute, this is also a class issue, then you become a profound danger. You become, remember he was labeled a terrorist by the internal system. When you're talking about like law enforcement, and he was labeled a, like public enemy number one in this space, and not just by the institutions, but as you said in the beginning, Chris, like there were people, including Black people. So stop talking about you would have marched with him. You would have been at your dining room table talking about why he acting like that, why he should just be getting along, why he trying to stir up trouble. It wasn't just rednecks talking that way. It wasn't just Bull Connor talking that way. There were Black people who were like, "Yo, let's find other ways to just assimilate, and we'll get our turn in a couple hundred years. Y'all just be chill. Why you out there marching and causing a ruckus?" Right? But now, of course, everybody, today is like, "Oh, I would have been no." But that's from my recollection. Like that was a big part of why it amplified his status as an enemy to the status quo of the American value system, which is inherently not only anti-Black and brown and indigenous, but also anti, economic equity and justice.
Yeah, I was just even going to comment, like Whitney Young was attacking Dr. King. You know what I mean? Whitney Young of the Urban League, right, was a straight up attack dog on Dr. King. Also, on top of that, that was a couple weeks before the Poor People's Campaign was planned to happen. In D.C., they were planning to have a whole situation. The Poor People's Campaign was about to happen a month from the time he got assassinated. And at that point, they planned to stay out on the lawn until they cut the check, right? Dr. King had a full plan to organize across class and bring other folks into the fold in order for this confluence onto DC until they submitted and actually gave what they were demanding. And that's not a coincidence that happened, was supposed to happen a month before he was assassinated. And Dr. King was very clear that no longer was the issue just simply just fighting for civil rights. That was a fight for human rights, and it was a fight for economic rights. It's all, he even said, it's all good that my Black son can sit next to your white daughter at the same counter, order the hamburger, right? But then the question then becomes, can my son afford that hamburger? And that's when he became a threat.
Yeah. And from, some people said hey, when he started moving away from the civil rights and consumer rights, rather, to the human rights, which is also a fascinating part because, just it's best to understand the Black struggle when you, instead of Booker T versus WB, but you Booker T and WB and Marcus Garvey, then you kind of have a full center. And the same thing with Malcolm and Martin. They both started talking about human rights, and they both got taken out, right, when that was starting to happen.
It's really interesting about that with Malcolm, Martin, and Fred Hampton is at the moment that all three of them got closer to a multiracial, class-based movement that saw the humanity across the lines, that's when they became threatening. They weren't threatening as long as they stuck to their own people, right? Black nationalism wasn't seen as much of a threat because it wasn't uniting other people, right? You had the Weather Underground, you had some other white and Chicano. There's other ancillaries, but the moment that you started creating a universalist moment, a human rights, and kind of everybody together and class based, is the moment that those three people, they became very dangerous. Dr. King, Malcolm and Fred Hampton. They were all taken out. So that has to tell you that that's probably the most dangerous thing in America.
And the thing about it, Chris, which I think we got to keep emphasizing and reminding people, because we're distracted. We were distracted in the '60s, so let alone now with all the distractions. I sent them this thing. I got a ad for like something app. I don't even know what it is, but I was like, oh, here's another distraction that's coming, right? Like the narrative that they'll want to tell you is like, oh, it's just this lone crazy wolf that would have killed, the crazy drunk KKK member and the wife beater is the three. But when in reality, the institutions killed all three of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And where can we point to where the institutions have changed so radically and so where they are now just they may be more subdued, maybe like where's the line of demarcation of like, hey, the government was killing us back then, but now the government is pro-human being, right? Like, when did that happen? Because I would need someone to point it out to me and like really teach me with crayons and cardboard paper so I can understand it. Because I'm missing that. But like, it's not the random crazy boy. It's the institutions that are established in our country that killed all three of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think the lesson from that today, if we're teaching this as a lesson to young people today, the lesson number one is to study the patterns in all of the leaders of the past and start connecting dots about what did make them dangerous. What were the points at which the system was going to push back? The country was going to push back. The institutions were going to push back. And all three of them got to that point. So I think it's like incumbent on us to teach the next generation of folks to be critically thinking about if you're going to be an activist.
Talking about King advocating that a revolution of values need to happen for America. And if America didn't do that quote unquote, they'd be drugged down a long dark corridor of desperation and despair. And he got assassinated. Fred Hampton, right, a year after, got assassinated. And then when we were even talking about these issues, I'm sure like somebody was like, yeah, that's not going to happen again. So when we even talk about King's legacy today, the statue in DC, like I'm all about the statue in DC. I'm happy that they did that. But the fact that Walmart, Boeing, I forget the name of the other major bank that did it, were the ones that financed it. I'm like, okay, so nobody's going to pay attention that these three major corporations that are arguably very against what King's legacy was all about are the ones that funded his statue. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, and I think it was like a group of corporate donors that actually made that statue. I mean, it's a good point. And I think, right, like it makes us go back to when we talk about the King that people don't want us to talk about today or know, it's challenging that things like the three evils that we just said, earlier, poverty, capitalism, or poverty, militarism, and racism. We hear a lot about addressing racism, but those other two, militarism and capitalism, seem to fall off the docket all the time. Yeah. And I think
that's
it's
how
partially
you get to be unpatriotic.
Well, you unpatriotic,
anti-American.
But that's the crazy thing. It's like even the language of like, say, the Declaration of Independence, which King referenced a lot, right? These values, this mythology that has been created within this society, it's kind of like when you actually hold it up to the mirror and be like, okay, now actually stand for those values, apply those values to everyone. It becomes an issue. Not only an issue, but it becomes a threat. And for King even, I could only imagine the last couple years of that man's life where folks like Whitney Young, not to throw him under the bus, but I'm going to throw that man under the bus, Roy Wilkins, all these people started to distance themselves.
Lightfoot. What was the boy that was the Lightfoot? It was a pastor that was constantly used to undermine and go against. He was collaborating with the FBI. Like, yeah, let's take him down. Let's take King down.
Yeah, and see, I don't even know that man's name, and I studied this stuff a lot, which is crazy, right? So, like, when we're talking about this, it's like King, at the end of his life, probably felt betrayed. Betrayed not only by his, by believing that this can happen and real change can occur, but like from people who he considered his allies. Like when he came out against the Vietnam War, people were like, oh, well, why don't you just worry about civil rights? Stay in your lane. You're doing too much, right? I could only imagine that sense of like, but did you listen to me from the first place? That I'm about justice and I'm consistent across the board about that. And so when I speak out about these things, I expect my allies, the people who are supposed to be for human rights, the people who are supposed to be for justice, to stand with me. And he was left alone from that. It just makes me extremely upset about like that reality, because quite frankly, that reality is much more harsher now.
Yeah. And I when I think about what it takes to be him, I think the reason we sanitize him is because it's so hard to be as committed as he was committed to the values that we say we have. There's a few quotes here from Dr. King. We should go directly to his words. And I want to see what you guys think of some of his words and how it applies to today, to the things that we're talking about today. And some of them, I forget how straight up he was about racism in the United States and about the difference between, Black freedom and white opinion, right? Like he would just lay it out. And I always forget about how straight up he was about it. He says, white Americans must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. He wrote that in 1960, that came out in 1969 in A Testament of Hope, an essay from him. What about this idea is important to us now that the structures are the things that we should be fighting to change, not the hearts and minds?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the fundamental part. I think we can be duped, lulled to sleep with doing the other things, and that's why even like, with the idea of, some of the emotional reactions, and I'm for it. Like, Ish mentioned the statue for Dr. King. I'm also like, okay with taking down a bunch of other statues, that Robert E. Lee and other folks. Right. But like, I think too often that looks like the win. What I mean? Like that looks like the win, and the structure remains the same. And the structure will say, hey, you know what? I will appease you and we'll take that down, or we'll add this, or we'll claim that, or we'll post this. But the structure, we're going to, they're going to defend that till the end. Right. And so, I think we got to be really careful. Like when he says the structure from the 60s to now, it's only been buffered and reinforced and solidified further. It's probably, we were probably closer to, if it was possible, closer to the unrest of the 60s and 70s to get something like that done. I can only imagine how challenging and difficult. And nothing's impossible, right? Like, the work continues, a little continua, right? And Victoria Certa. And the reality is, it is so far more entrenched now. Because when we're talking about structure, we're talking about the education system, the economic system, the law enforcement system, the court, right? Like it is massive, right? It's like the Matrix, right? It's going to constantly reinforce and protect itself layer upon layer upon layer.
I've said it before, I think. If you study white supremacy enough, I called it a self-cleaning oven, because it really just, all of its dirt, it re-cleans. Now you come out dirty as hell. Like everybody else comes out dirty as hell. But the sins of white supremacy are instantly vanished. They vanish. They just they disappear. And it reifies itself consistently like that, which is why this thing around the structures, we focus a lot on emotional things oftentimes and thematic things, but are we making structural changes in the United States? Because that's what he was pushing for, not for the theatrics of it all, the I have a dreams of it all. He doesn't have a dream. He didn't have a dream that people were holding hands together. He had a dream that the economic system would be fair.
The structure would
He
change,
had a system, or he had a dream that that courts, a Black man in court, would have an equal opportunity to get justice in courts, in schools, equal resources in schools, and all this stuff. Those are structural changes, and that makes me think today. We've talked before in this show about the fight against CRT, which feels like it just came out of nowhere, right? It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of late stage white supremacy starting to worry about its future and wanting to prolong its future. CRT, whether you like it or don't, whether you understand it or you don't, very simply put, all it is an investigative tool to be able to investigate systems for discriminatory patterns. So when they talk about CRT, they could call it Marxist and everything else they want. All it is a microscope that looks at systems and looks for patterns of discriminations and finds them so that you can change the structures.
That's the important piece too, what you mentioned, the patterns.
The patterns.
Right? They're not one-offs. They're
Right.
structural and they're patterns that consistently you can see if you want to.
And if you try to outlaw people seeing the patterns, what you're trying to do, in effect, is make sure that they never free themselves, right? Like what you're trying to do is make sure that we never see that you get a longer sentence in court if you are Black. Here's a structural change. I've proposed this before. Sharif, I know you've heard me say this before. I think that everybody should be sentenced in court with what I call the Black standard. So whoever you are,
I just sent you something today because I thought about you when you said that. Somebody did a skit with that. Like the white lady she was in court and they said, you're going to be tried as a Black man. And, so every image of you in the court is you could be looking at this 300-pound muscular Black man. And her father at a press conference is like, no beautiful white woman should ever, some photogenic white woman should ever be tried as a Black man. That's not fair.
Well, I mean, but this is my point. It would be fair. That would be a structural change. Once you saw a pattern that this one group of people, Black males specifically, when they get sentenced, on average, it's going to be a longer sentence. You can say, okay, well, let's change the structure of this. Let's give everybody the Black man sentence then. Because that'll be the fastest way to change the system, right? To improve it. It would change overnight. All you would need is that photogenic white woman to get the Black man standard of charges brought against her, and that would be the end. I'm making too much of it, laughing about it slightly, but my point is they're now taking away the tools to be even be able to investigate the systems.
Oh yeah,
and
the critical analysis, right? Like that's part of school. Is to have people be able to do a critical analysis, to be critical thinkers. And what easier way to get people to, to pacify the masses, like don't allow that. You know what I mean? So it went from you're not allowed to read to, all right, you can read. Well, maybe we'll teach you how to read. But even if we teach you how to read, we're not going to teach you how to think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they shouldn't have to, because honestly, you free yourself. What is the quote? They'll never teach you what you need to overthrow them or whatever.
Yourself, yeah.
All right. So listen, fellas, I'm giving a speech next week. I'm at the Hilton. I'm the keynote speaker. And I start the speech off with...
I hope you wear a fancy suit.
I'm going to wear a fancy suit. And I'm saying this. Whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. Now, it's 2024.
On their brunch.
I was about to say my little American Express funded brunch that I'm speaking at. Can I start with what he said in 1967? He said that in Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, 1967.
Good luck.
Yeah. They'll be saying that you're racist, that you're being anti-white or whatever nonsense. I mean, like the mental gymnastics that's going on now when folks talk about race and racism. It's like everything and everybody can be that, even though the power dynamic, again, goes back to the structure, to the system. It's taken out, and then it's individuals. Well, saying that makes you racist. And you know what I mean? It ignores the reality that, no, it's an analysis of the system. You have accepted that identity and the history that's associated with that identity. And then we're speaking about power dynamics and how they operate. That is not racist. That is speaking about the racial reality that King was speaking then, that I would even argue that is much more not clear today.
Let me ask you about that, Ish. Just let me challenge you just on that. It's not really a challenge. It's a question. So we talk about this word racist, and now it's been used against us, where we somehow have become capable of racism, right?
Yeah. Reverse racism.
They said that during Reconstruction, real quick. You know that, right? When they were giving rights to black people, they're like, you're being racist against whites by providing all these extra supports to black people.
Which is why
they said that.
My point being is we should have never been for equality. We should have always been for justice, because justice would have given us black specific remedies rather than equality remedies. Right. So this stuff around equality, honestly, was a trick, because that's why they're using those exact same equal systems against us. If you do it against us, it's racist, because we all have to be equal now. And Native Americans didn't ask for equality. They asked for land. They asked for self-governance, the ability to build their own schools and all that type of stuff. So I always say that to say, okay, let me concede that it might be racist, because all racist could mean at some point is that you acknowledge that there is such a thing as races, and they are categorized as different races, and you're just observing the reality. Okay, call me racist, because I observe races. I see races. I'm like that dude in the Sixth Sense. I see races. I see dead people. Whatever, right? But I also see anti-blackness, which is different than racism. So that's far different. That's a different animal. So you can call me racist, but you can't call me anti-black.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just go back to the intellectual genealogy of what racism actually is. Why was racism created in the first place, right? When we're even talking about American foreign policy, when we're talking about constructions of who's superior, who's inferior, what's the hierarchy in which pseudo-scientific ideas were developed that inform and frame our points of reference when we talk about who's the scholars or the philosophers that we co-sign, right? Like Kant and all these other racist people, right? The very core of it was anti-blackness. And there's a hierarchy from there, but black people are always at the bottom of that equation when it came to who is capable of thinking, who is capable of being civilized, right? And if you even read the documents from the 1900s, from the 1920s, from the 1930s and 1940s, they're straight up saying that. They're saying that black people are incapable of these things and that they're at the bottom. So like when I think of racism, I go back to why was it even created in the first place, right? So like, it's like me being anti-Semitic towards you. Can I be anti-Semitic towards you? No, because you're not Semitic in that frame of reference. You understand what I mean?
Right.
I would also say that applies to racism.
I might be Semitic. You don't know that.
Oh, well, yeah. That's why I said why I added that.
And Sharif might be too. He just got back from Egypt. He
and Mecca.
I just saw pictures of him riding camels and stuff. So, no, it's a good point that you're making, though. Is like, what is the origin of these things? Why aren't we talking about those things again? Pattern recognition. The reason that we're not talking about educating ourselves and our children in schools and wherever about that particular point that you just made is because we want to act like today came out of a vacuum. Like all the problems we see today just came out of a vacuum. There was some point in time where all the slaves were freed, all the enslaved people were freed, and all of a sudden everybody got their rights to vote and all that. And from that point on, everything was equal. So if you're in a bad situation today, it's only because you messed up your equality, right? I need y'all to help me with that, because that date obviously didn't happen while Dr. King was still alive. So it must have been after 1968 that date hit. Was it 71? Was it 76? Was it 82? Was it 93? Well, tell me what the date was when things became equal and we messed it up from there. And today has
in
no
our
bearing.
Textbooks. We just got to find it. It's in our textbook. They pointed it out and just,
listen, slavery was a jobs
I was
program.
absent that day, so that's why I don't know.
You didn't see that part, huh?
Yeah.
Well, let's go to another quote from Dr. King. This is, I think, a little bit germane to the anti-CRT fight today. He says, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And today we have people, as recently as yesterday, I was reading one more person who said, "I can't believe they're teaching kids that the world is divided between oppressors and the oppressed." And they're brainwashing kids to believe that the whole world is divided into those two, and that is not not real. It's not reality. Dr. King said that in 1963 in a letter from a Birmingham jail. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. That actually, and I want to make this point very clear for people, that point actually didn't die after he said it and wasn't born the moment that he said it. That is part of Black intellectual thought systems always of investigating our current status. Frantz Fanon has a piece of saying that exact same thing about the colonization of Africa and other places. You think in terms of the oppressor and the oppressed because there is an oppressor and you are being oppressed and all you are doing is telling the truth about your situation. Now, what they want you to do is to go outside and start getting wet and say and deny that it's raining, right? You saying it's raining and I'm getting rained on to a person who has an umbrella who says, oh man, you're always talking about getting wet, right? That's exactly what this is, right? If you are the oppressor, you have no vested interest in anybody ever talking about it, even pointing out, how you got to where you are. And you want to tell the oppressed something like, when they tell you that you're oppressed, they're just making you a victim.
You're just victim. Yeah.
They're just giving you a victim mentality. And then you have Kool-Aid drinking fools who get on TV and other places on social media repeating that. I'm not a victim. I've never been discriminated against. I have 4 medical degrees. This one brother I saw online saying that. If I'm so oppressed, how did I get 4 medical degrees? I was like, first of all, brother, there's no such thing as medical degrees. You must be a CNA. You must be like an EMT or something like that because you're talking really ignorant right now. You sound real stupid. But think about the Jedi mind trick of that. Now you can't even point out the fact like someone has a boot on your throat and you can't say anything about the boot. Right? Like
I wanted to be down here. Like, and if I like this is, it's
I don't like to breathe. Breathing is overrated. Right?
How dare you blame this boot, this system? And I think that's the danger of, a few years ago, of course, we were talking about like this idea of like meritocracy and like nothing wrong with that in neutrality, meritocracy. But when you apply the systems and the structures and the history and all of that, don't just tell kids like, oh, there's nothing against you. There's no systems against you. You just have to work hard. When we know, again, back to patterns, even if you work hard, here's what's happening. Your house is going to be undervalued. You worked hard, you purchased a home, and they're going to undervalue it simply because you're Black.
And research has shown that.
And like you just said, research shows that. That's you investigated, you saw a pattern, and they want to take that away from you. They want to take pattern recognition away from you. You went and looked at a whole bunch of mortgage applications. You went and sent out audit testers as a Black family and a white family into a housing market, and you investigate over a period of time, you will see a pattern. And that pattern is the Black family and the white family having exactly the same credentials will have different outcomes. And that, no matter how you feel, whatever your politics are, you still have to ask the question, well, why is that? If you're a science person, like if you believe in science, you're like, oh, I investigated this. I found a pattern. The pattern is when you go to Wells Fargo to apply for a loan, if you're Black, even if you're upper middle class, with the exact same qualifications as a white family, you will get a different loan. You will get a loan that has worse terms that will cost you money in the long run. If you're selling your house and you take the pictures of your family down, if you're Black family, and replace them with a white family, it will up the value, material value. Significant. Your house will go from $200,000 to $400,000. Now apply that over time, compound that. That's not just one family. That's many families. This is why they don't want us to have a tool for looking at the system under a microscope and getting down to these little interactions, because then we won't be able to see the big picture. We'll say at that point, what we will do is we will say, well, you don't want to be a victim. No, but I do want my mortgage to be right.
How about that? Again, it goes back to the intergenerational wealth. And the thing about it, here's where the systems are. It's not the first time the banks do this. They pay the fine and say, all right, we'll pay the fine. And we're going to do it again. And in 10 years, you'll come and you'll investigate it and you'll find us again. And we're like, all right, that's fine. Like you're fine is fine. Like we're okay with it.
That to me sounds like, and this is a capitalism way of thinking. In the 1970s, Ford knew that their car, the Pinto, was blowing up. They knew that the gas tank was in the wrong place, and when you would hit the back of that car, it would blow up like a bomb. And they estimated, I believe this, someone can fact check me on this. I believe they estimated and calculated what would be more expensive, to fix that as a problem or to just pay out settlements when it became an issue, right? And they went with, well, let's just keep it, secret. It was either the Ford Pinto or the Corvair with seatbelts. It was one of those stories where they definitely did the math. And the math was like, it's better to do the wrong thing than the right thing. So they did the wrong thing. Ish, I have a question specifically for you, brother. So this is one of his quotes that deals with violence versus nonviolence. We have some people in our history, our portfolio of voices who were nonviolent, and then there were some that believed that violence was a necessary part of resistance and liberation. Dr. King talked about in terms of tension, and he says, I referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of construction nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. He wrote that in a letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. What do you think? What does that say about where we are today? How we should be teaching our young people, our activism? Should we, what is that tension? Where is that part where we go too far, right? Or we don't go far enough?
Well, yeah. Well, first I gotta say, out of anybody I've ever read, King really challenges that idea to the core, and even speaks on nonviolence in a way that really truly challenges my own conceptions as I was growing up about the effectiveness and use and need of violence is necessary or inevitable, right? I think that tension is part of what his strategy was all about. You go to a place that's full of tension, you create a more tense situation, you bring in national media, you make a big deal out of it, and then you push for the changes that you want to see. Now, I would contend a lot of that got some successes, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 65, right? Some favorable court decisions. But at the same time, I would also say that King also realized that that needed to be taken up a notch. And hence the Poor People's Campaign, in which I was referring to earlier, where in the Poor People's Campaign, they're like, we're going to sit at the doorstep of Washington, D.C.'s doorstep of the Capitol building and stay there until they give us what we demand, right? And I think that that type of tension needs to happen. I don't know if either y'all go to protest ever, but it's real interesting. Like you go to a protest and be like, shut it down, like all this stuff. And then everybody disperses and goes home. I feel like the tension has been lost. Folks putting their bodies on the line. And quite frankly, folks who are consider themselves co-conspirators need to be doing that much more often, right? To be putting their bodies on the line to stop the stuff that's happening in the sense of war, in the sense of what's happening to our environment, to all the things that King was advocating for back then. But as Sharif was saying earlier, I think there is a lot of distractions, mirages, and camouflages that kind of distort what that actually means. King's whole point was you create tension by being in a place you're not supposed to be. You make it dramatic. You challenge the very core of what folks are saying by being there. And then you hold them accountable for what they do to you. Right. And that's how he was able to push a lot of things. Now, it could be debatable how effective that is now, because you best believe folks learn from that. Right. We see that even with the protests in Europe with folks against the environment, or people gluing themselves to the street or stopping traffic. Right. People are arrested on the back end, right? You're going to be on a camera now. There's a much more details where they can come back a month later and be like, yeah, we saw you there. So you're going to be losing this. Now you don't have this job opportunity because it follows you on this record, electronic record forever, right? This is a different time period. So like what King was talking about definitely challenges me to the core, but we also have to be much more smart about what we're doing now. I think that it's the first time in history folks like us are even in positions to have this level of influence in structures, and that we have to be very purposeful in these structures about how we're doing and how we're operating and who we're bringing in and how we're bringing in folks and what we're doing it for. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who talk that game, but when it comes down to it, be like, oh, I can't say that. Oh, you're crazy by saying something like that, right? And we need to step away from that and realize the only way we're going to produce this tension is if we're unapologetic in those spaces, while at the same time making space and creating the situation and context for other folks who do want to take more radical action to have a safer space and potentially even find a job after all that happens. And I think about my brother Ant Smith, who's going to be going to jail for a year next week, and for what his involvement was in the George Floyd protest. And not only the worst thing, him going to jail for a year, that man is not allowed to teach for 10 years. They made that part of his punishment, not to be able to teach for 10 years, because folks understand that that's the real power. When you're in those positions, when you're speaking to youth, when you're challenging folks to think for themselves, you're on another type of level at that point. And they took that away from him because they were afraid what he might do because his role during the George Floyd protest. And I think that speaks right now to the situation that we're facing.
You know, two quick points. One around just protest. You asked, you know, if we go to protest. Now, bro, listen. That's a young man's game. First of all, I just want to say that. I know there's some old people out there, but that's a young man's game.
I know you ain't asked me that. Like, you know,
I feel like I gave at the office. I did that years ago. And the thing that I will say about that is that today's activists and protesters are so much more sophisticated than our kind of aimless ones that we did. Like, you know, we did protests, we made noise, we got loud, we got in front of people. But the extent to which they now do debriefs afterwards and understand organizing and organization and understand the use of social media and these what we were just talking about, these points of tension, like they stop traffic in the right places. They know like where to put a pain point. That's so much more organized than like the 90s old school type of protesting, where it was just really about getting loud, getting out there, being seen, being heard. But, you know, listen, if you're stopping traffic, you have estimated where's a good place to have a protest. First of all, like you've done some thinking about it. So I will say that part. The second thing,
there's a difference between protest and shutting things down.
Well, I mean, I feel like protests should be focused on an action that causes tension or pressure, right? Mm-hmm. So protests should be shutting things down or getting in the way of things operating normally. That's what Dr. King taught. Basically, was your bus system's not going to work the way that it normally works if you keep on doing this. You know, we're going to interrupt your system, and I don't know that we can get our folks boycotting as much right now, but they definitely, I think, are better at creating tension and tension points. The thing I'll say about Dr. King, to me, that's the most critical thing that I think is the Dr. King that people don't speak enough about, is that Dr. King was a theologian. Dr. King was a faith-based person. He was a Christian. He was a Christian evangelical. He was based and rooted in the church. His thinking didn't come out of thin air. His thinking around these things were rooted in something. And many of the people today who have all the wrong politics claim Christianity, and they don't know anything about the theology of what they're talking about. Their commercialized prosperity gospel theology is no way in touch with why he was talking about we need a radical revolution of values. That's revolution he was saying. And that was a Christian theological point that today is missing from Christian evangelicism, white nationalism mixed with Christianity. That's the most dangerous, in my estimation. I'm just speaking as one guy. That is the most dangerous, because his activism was rooted in something that's universal and very deep. Lots of philosophies behind that. He wasn't making this up. as he went along. Not only was he a theologian, he was also a philosopher, right? He read the philosophies of the world. So what's dangerous about him was he articulated it so well. He actually took all of that thinking, all of that faith, all of that talk about values and biblical type of stories, and made them real for the people, made them real for the masses. And he connected it to real everyday issues like poverty, like, housing discrimination. So anyways, that's what I will say is I think his one of his biggest understudied parts of his work was that it was theological work. And we have many people today, like, the majority of Americans consider themselves to be Christian, and they support wars, right? We have in red states, in states led by Republican governors, they're now taking away school lunch. One governor said, "I don't believe in welfare." So that's why he's taking the lunch away. And the poor will only get, if you give them something for free, they'll only get dependent on that or whatnot. And I'm thinking this is an evangelical governor too. One who in the morning will be meeting with a bunch of Christian people at a morning prayer breakfast, and then go to a meeting with others to take away school lunch, right? Because I remember in the chapter of BS, Jesus said, the poor should not get fed. I remember that part. Don't you remember that part? Y'all remember that part where he said that? Blessed are the rich, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Didn't he say that? Did he say that part? Thou shalt treat every race but white race poorly. Jesus said that. No, he didn't say that. Didn't say that at all. Ish, I don't know where you stand on the faith question. Sharif, I know that you have studied all this, but where do you all see faith's connection to our strategies that we have for freeing ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, just the idea of spirituality and how that's always been part of resistant movements is an important part. At the same time, we know that religion has been used to oppress, and people don't always, it doesn't necessarily go past people's throat. They can say words, but often, even if the policy contradicts what they say they believe in, they will do, like you said, this mental gymnastics to figure out how to, when you see that some of Trump's most ardent supporters are not just evangelical Christians, we also have evangelical Muslims. Because if one of his policies can stand against something that they don't like, then they're like, hey, well, I'll ignore all the other stuff and I'm going to prop him up. Right. And we see this over and over and over again in across religions, where we see this happening, where someone can be as blatantly anti-Christian values as a Trump, like unapologetically. Like, it's not like he's like, oh, hypocrite, he's saying one thing, do it. Like, no, he's like actually kind of anti-Christian in so many of his stances, verbally, policy-wise, and etc. But yet you have the folks who they would call themselves the most religious, tied to him indiscriminately, and so that just speaks to so many other things. You saw this from enslavement through the civil rights movements to now. That's a continuous pattern. Back to patterns, pattern recognition. That is certainly one of them, and it crosses religions, and of course we're in a Christian country, so it's even more prominent, but it definitely crosses religions as well.
Yeah, and just to veggie back off of that real quick, I would even say you just said the intellectual.
Shout out to the veggie backs.
Yes, veggie backs. We don't eat that pig. No, but
is that what that means?
Yes.
See, y'all done
say
made this show.
Spam. Don't say that against spam on these shows, bro. Like that.
Y'all done made this show overwoke. Right? Like, overwoke my show. He said veggie backs.
Well, you got healthy lifestyle.
To tofu back on that point that you're making. All right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there.
No, just to veggie back off of what Sharif was just saying. When he was talking about the intellectual genealogy of Black people using religious and religion belief for resistance, right? But there's also an intellectual genealogy in this country of white folks using religion for oppression, right? I always, ask my students, are you talking about the God of George Washington or the God of Harriet Tubman, right? Are you talking about the God that you pray to get more, to have more over other people? That is embedded within the very context of what this country was founded upon. And are you talking about the God that's like, I'm praying for freedom, I'm praying for justice, I'm praying for the folks who don't have anything around the world, the oppressed, the ones that need prayer, right? See, there's a difference in that. But in this country, there's a whole intellectual genealogy where it was even proven that they even took verses from the Bible in order not to inspire enslaved people from reading
Deleted them to us. Like, all right, even if you can read, here's what are we going. It's the same thing now, right? Like erasure. It's again pattern recognition.
Yeah, and people, people listening to this should look up the Slave Bible, right? Just look it up. Just go for yourself, and you'll see what happened. The redactions of everything that was liberatory, and the inclusion of only things that created obedience to slavery is exactly what the Slave Bible was. So, if you're Christian and you're listening to this and you're upset by what you just heard, you should be. You should be, because it's part of history. You go to the African American Museum in DC, and they have Nat Turner's Bible, which Nat Turner was on fire for Jesus and about liberation. He had read the other Bible. he had read the red letter Bible, which was the one with the real kind of words. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So poverty, that addresses poverty right there. So Christians taking away school lunch is ridiculous, but Dr. King was right in line with poverty as a something to be focused on. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. These are all things that the current politics don't support right now. When you said that when you said that Trump has a contingent of Christians supporting him, which he does, white evangelicals. Do they comfort people who mourn? Do they look for the people who are poor in spirit? Do they lift up the people who are meek? This is a dude with a gold bathtub, right? Like, is that meek? Is he going to inherit the earth? Blessed are those who are hungry and thirst after righteousness. Is that him? Is that you? Like really?
They talking about you?
Blessed are the merciful. Is there anything about us right now that is merciful? We are the opposite in so many ways. Our policies, our politics, our media, our foreign, diplomacy, none of it is merciful. It's all based in oil and money and greed and beating each other out. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Anyways, these things I think drove Dr. King more than anyone today, number one, wants to observe. Because you bring this up to Christians today and they're like, we don't need that type of negativity in our life. Leave me alone. I just want to hate people.
Think positive. Think positive,
Why are you always so negative?
If you just tie your monthly fruits to the church, I'm sorry. It's crazy to me how folks have fell for the okie doke in that regard. We have lost the focus of really what King was talking about, what the quotes that you're talking about. Like, folks have this society has individualized and be like, well, I help out my neighbor. I send, charity to Shriners or, starving African children. I'm doing my part. You're racist because you're talking about race and social inequality. Stop being woke. And it's literally flipped on itself, where we have these folks who pray, who claim to be Christians, go to church every Sunday, and they're more likely to support somebody like Trump. That is statistics. You can straight look that up. Majority of those folks vote for Trump. So what does that tell you about the value center of what they claim to be? And then how does that relate to the very foundation of what this society says it's based off of, or is actually based on? It's crazy to me.
So on that point, I'll say this about Christianity. We were always trained in Christianity to look out for false prophets and false prophecies and for false applications of the religion. That's all throughout the Bible. You're supposed to watch out for that. the what you just mentioned in terms of the modern kind of application of Christianity for many people is a commitment to the three evils
Yeah.
that King
So
talks
yeah.
about.
Mm-hmm.
You have Christian congressmen who take their Christmas photos with AK-47s, have the whole family holding guns, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. But here you are in a picture representing Christ with guns in your hand, right? So it's a very dirty misapplication of the faith, and some might even say that's evil. I think the Bible would even say doing that to the word is evil, right? Because the Bible is very clear about peace and peacemakers and justice and righteousness. Let me end on this, and I'll ask you each to say, what do you think is the King, Dr. King, that they don't want you to know about? I will say that the Dr. King that they don't want you to know about is the Dr. King that wasn't lost in the theatrics of the beautiful kind of speeches that they like to pull up, but the one who had a serious critical critique of the United States systems, the systems of justice, the systems of economics, the economic system, and the racial social systems that kept people locked out of living good lives, specifically Black people. So he had a serious racial analysis. He called things what they were. He talked about white people and Black people, and did not fall into any nonsense about that being racist, just calling things what they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the Dr. King that's not going to get talked about in the breakfasts. The Dr. King that everybody wants to talk about is the one that has you reading the slave Bible, has you just being obedient to the way things are now and all holding hands. Just all hold hands now and pretend like the problem isn't the problem. He would have never, I think, endorsed that. And I think it's perverse to do that to him in his death, to make such a smear on his real view of the world. So that's the King they don't want you to know about, and that's the one they're not going to talk about. So, brothers, what do you think? As a final word, what do you think is the Dr. King that they don't want you to know about?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think 100%. I think another aspect or angle of Dr. King that they refuse to acknowledge, some are wholly ignorant about, is his searing indictment on white America. If we say mindsets matter most, the way that he talked about very, again, directly, as far as the mindsets that perpetuate and there's the unwillingness to change, structures and their mindsets about, what this country has been, where he talked, they love to talk about the dream. Most of what he talked about was the nightmare. Mm-hmm. And they refuse to acknowledge that. And I think another aspect that's really, we're going to hear it all next week, is about this idea of just integration. And what did that mean for him? Where it meant integration in certain places, certain things, certain reasons, certain tactics, but it wasn't integration the way to erase Black people, erase Black schools, erase Black institutions. But that is how, often it's talked about. As soon as you talk about Black spaces, people want to quote Dr. King. Interesting enough, I think I said this to you, Chris, too. Remember those old Microsoft when you needed help? That big paper clip would pop up, and if you were typing something on Word, Bernice King did something like that with a meme, just like, "Oh, I see you quoting my father.
Right,
let me help
right.
you if you need help. Write out, write to me." So it reminded me of that. But yeah, we're going to see a whole lot of of that.
Yeah, I think the King that they don't want us to know exactly all what the Sharif said, what you just said, Chris. I think it also, he was very clear, he wasn't foolish. It's not integrate ourselves out of power. What's that about? He said that to teacher association in Georgia in 1967, right? He was very clear. But I think it's also the King that they don't want us to know is the King that was against war, against poverty, right? Thinking that the government should be playing an active role in poverty. I think the King they don't want us to know about is the King that isn't Santa Claus, right? That most people didn't like him. that he wasn't a popular figure when he was assassinated, that he was assassinated, right? They don't want folks to feel that anger that was so palatable after that happened, which should even be much more stronger today than ever before. They don't want people to feel that way. They don't want people to ask those questions, to really challenge those structures and systems in which King identified that we need to, right? And he said, I labored to change the system a little here, a little there, but I realize now that we need a revolution of values. You know, that's what King was all about, because he recognized even his own accomplishments in his own lifetime fell short for the vision that needed to happen for this country. And we have to recognize that that vision not only did not happen, but was then brought back and then made sure it never would happen. And we should be pissed off about that.
Man,
and that's what the King don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I challenge the listeners to really, did this with some students a while back. Like, actually, as you hear the news and other folks talk about it, how few actually talk about that the system killed him. Like, if you didn't know any better, you'd think he just died peacefully at an old age in his sleep, because they talk about the dream, but again, not the nightmare. They don't talk about, like, not only was he vilified, harassed, threatened, blackmailed, he was murdered. Mm-hmm. You rarely hear that part. They'll show a clip. They'll show the march on Washington, and they'll share. You'll hear a sound bite from "I Have a Dream" about children, being in this, beautiful oasis in the midst of rabidly racist America, right? Like, that's what you hear. But like, he was murdered. Like, let's start with that. Why would my mother used to say Americans need to stop celebrating birthdays and start analyzing, murder days. Like, why were they murdered? She's like, they spend so much time on birthdays and just like, oh yeah, he was born. Oh yeah, here's what he did. He was born. Here's what we did. She's like, no, actually look at why were they martyred and focus your attention on that. She's like, as long as they celebrate the birthdays, that's a distraction about what they died for. She's like, focus the children on what did they die for? What were the values, the stances, the orientation that he died for? If not, they'll distract you with the birthday cake and the balloons.
And I think that's a great place to stop. Everybody should learn the lesson that none of it was pretty, right? You're talking about people that were willing to die for what they believed in. And I think there's a lot of people today who talk as if they're about that life. And there's a lot of bluster, right, about that. But I think what Dr. King, Fred Hampton and Malcolm and others, many others, I think what they all prove to us is that when you fly too close to the sun in the United States, you actually die. Right. And I think that actually is the reason why so many of our revolutionaries were hired into government jobs and into the nonprofit industrial complex in the 1970s and the 1980s, because it was better to live than to die. Right. Like, so the politics just changed. Maybe we could do some community service type stuff. But young people, I love the energy, but don't be online acting like you're ready to die for the cause. You ain't about that life. And us old people, like, listen, I'm not trying to get out here and do all that either myself, just so you know. But I think you got to get to a certain age where you marvel at the fact that the man's last speech was predicting his own death, and he still was going to go out the way that he was going to go out, right? You have to marvel at that and give some respect to it. Put some respect on his name. Yeah. Anyways, we appreciate you all, as always, for listening, for watching, and for sharing our show. Freedom Friday intends to educate and intends to tell you the things that they won't tell you about our own history, about our lessons, about our learning, for our own purposes, not for anybody else's gaze, anybody else's purpose except for us. So hopefully I can say to you once again, this has been another Freedom Friday, but you're still not free. But you're freer than you were when we started. And thank you for that. Appreciate you. As always, keep listening.